Let's turn to another one, Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah, it goes 2 Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Isaiah, there it is, chapter 6. By the way, it's not often emphasized nowadays, but if you really want to know the Word of God, you ought to know the books of the Bible. I meet people all the time that don't know, adults, and they don't know the books of the Bible. And I think that computers are almost a blight to our society because people hardly touch the Bible anymore. They have all their, and I'm a pro, I really like computer-aided study, but not if you neglect the book. And you really ought to, no matter what your age is, know the books of the Bible. I was just talking with someone, and I mentioned that I was preaching on Obadiah. And they said, what? I said, Obadiah. What's that? I said, it's a book of the Bible. They didn't even know it was in there. Can you imagine if they bumped into old Obadiah in heaven and didn't know he wrote a book of the Bible? How embarrassing that'd be. So you ought to learn at least the books and read them all. But look at chapter 6 of Isaiah. Because the fourth time that I believe we should fear God is when we come to realize His holiness. Not only the great attributes of omnipotence and omnipresence and omniscience, but His prime attribute. And the prime attribute of God is not love, and it's not mercy. The prime attribute of God is His holiness. And that's the least talked about. And that's the least desired one in our age. And everyone has grandfatherly put God off as a benign, soft-spoken Jesus in the corner. And they've forgotten that God is an infinite God of holiness. Holiness. Isaiah came to realize the holiness of God. Chapter 6, verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of His robe filled the temple. He saw God as He was, and God is holy. And above Him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their face, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. You notice that it took 4 of their wings to serve God, and only 2 to do work. They worshipped God, and then only 2 of them were working. We work more than we worship, but they worshiped more than they worked. And they cried to one another. And remember, I told you this before, that the Hebrews, the way they underline stuff is they don't put bold and caps and underline like you might on a birthday card, love, 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 and you underline it. And they don't use colorful colors, and they don't use italics. The way the Hebrews would emphasize something is they would repeat it. And this is the ultimate expression of God's holiness. They say it 3 times. And it's not stuttering. It's utter, awesome reverence. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His glory, as we talked about last week. And when they declared that, it says the posts of the doors were shaken, and the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, and all he did is he got one little tiny glimpse of the holiness of God. He saw God as He really is, holy. Now let me tell you this. You won't fear God if you don't see Him as He is. And if I see Christians, and if you see Christians who are living abysmal lives, there's no discipline in their life, there's no fear of God in their life, there's no personal holiness in their life. You know what I know? I know one thing clearly about them. They don't know anything about the holiness of God. Because look what happens in verse 5. As soon as he saw God as He was, he saw himself as he was. And you know what? He just picks one thing. He says, I'm a man of unclean lips. He must have had a little problem. Maybe he liked to tell stories. Maybe he was one that exaggerated for his own benefit. Maybe he was one that was disrespectful. I don't know what his deal was. But that's what came to his mind just like that. He says, I'm a man of unclean lips. I dwell in the midst of people of unclean lips, and mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And one of the seraphs, the seraphim, flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken from the tongs of the altar, and he touched my mouth. You know, when you see God as He is, and when you realize what you are, the first response from our heart is we want Him to clean us. You know, that really is the first response. My little 3-year-old this week, I spoke to him about something he did and talked to him about it and shared the Scriptures and everything else. And I said, what are we going to do about it? He says, I'm going to pray and ask God to clean me. I thought that was a great response. Don't they have profound responses? Because he knows that when he gets in the mud, he has to be cleaned. And when he gets his hands sticky and his face sticky, he has to be cleaned. And he realized what he did was wrong. And he said, I'm going to ask God to clean me. And he saw the difference between what mom and dad could clean and what only God could clean. And as soon as Isaiah saw himself as God saw him, he says, clean me. And he did. And he touched my mouth, verse 7. And said, behold, this has touched your lips. And it came from the altar. And the altar is a portrait of the great sacrifice of Christ. And it's only through the sacrificial death of Christ. It's only through his blood poured out for us that we can be cleansed. And when he went to God and said, clean me, God cleaned him. And that's because he feared God. He realized his holiness. I bet he didn't go back and tell the same stories anymore. I bet he didn't laugh at the same jokes. I bet he didn't do whatever he was doing to make his mouth clean. And when you get a little picture of the holiness of God, you don't go right back to whatever it is that defiles you and me from God's holiness. What's interesting is God takes unholy people and he uses them, because I heard the voice of the Lord saying, who shall I send and who will go for us? In verse 8, and Isaiah said, with his newly clean mouth, here I am, take me. You know, if you let him clean you, you can let him use you. Now, God does use unclean vessels. God uses broken vessels. God uses strange vessels. But God uses and keeps clean vessels. The others he uses and casts aside. He used Nebuchadnezzar, used Cyrus, he used Balaam, he used Balaam's donkey. But he keeps those that are clean. They're vessels of honor. When should we fear God? We should fear God, first of all, when we come to realize his omnipresence, as Joseph did. Secondly, when we come to realize his omnipotence, as Elijah did. Thirdly, when we come to realize his omniscience, as Elisha's servant did. We should also fear him when we come to realize his holiness. One last one before we go. Look at Daniel chapter 4. It goes Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel. Daniel chapter 4. We should fear God when we come to realize his sovereignty, as Nebuchadnezzar did. That's a great lesson to learn, that God is in charge and I'm not. You know, rich people have trouble with that. That's why the Lord said, few rich people get to heaven. You say, oh, good, I'm not rich. Yes, you are. You're rich this morning. I mean, unless you're in jail for poverty, you're rich compared to the rest of the world. We're rich. Far beyond, some of us are far beyond anything we could comprehend, but we're rich. Look at Genesis 4. Here's one of the richest men in the world. They always talk about how great Rockefeller was because he was rich before income taxes, and they talk about, the Rothschilds, and they talk about the Vanderbilts. Well, this guy was rich before anybody was writing books. I mean, this guy ran the world. He was, in God's estimation, the wealthiest empire. He was the Babylonian head of gold. Do you know why he was so rich? On Wednesday nights we learned this is the fellow that knocked off Nineveh. And Nineveh was the biggest city in the world, in the ancient world. Nineveh, Jonah, and the whale, and Nineveh. And Nebuchadnezzar came and took all the riches of Nineveh and added them to his own. That's why he became the absolute wealthiest man of all. Pure gold, solid gold image he made of himself, 60 feet high. Okay, look at chapter 4. And I'll start in verse 23. This is, by the way, chapter 4 is one of the more interesting chapters in the Bible because this chapter, as far as we can tell, is the only chapter of the Bible that wasn't written by a Hebrew prophet or someone associated with a prophet or an apostle. This chapter was written by a pagan king, a Gentile, Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, from just reading it looks like he wrote it himself and God inspired him to write it. But listen to his testimony of what happened, starting in verse 32. Because we should fear God when we come to realize his sovereignty like Nebuchadnezzar did. And it says, and they shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. This rich guy that lived in robes and palaces and had hanging gardens that were a wonder of the world is going to live with the oxen. And you'll eat grass like a cow, and 7 times shall pass over you, most likely 7 years, until you know, listen, that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. And he gives it to whomever he chooses. That's called sovereignty. And God says, I'm going to make you crawl around your hands and knees, and I'm going to make you eat grass, Mr. Big Shot, until you finally lift up your head while you're munching the grass and look up at me and say, you rule, Most High God. He said, when you do that, I'll bring you back. Well, That's what happens. Verse 33, in that very hour, the word was fulfilled. That's God's omnipotence. Whatever he says happens. His omniscience, he knows it's going to happen. His omnipresence, he's there to make it happen. His holiness is a standard he judges it by. His sovereignty is that he does what he wills for his glory. And he was driven from men and ate grass like an ox. And his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers. And that's why it wasn't 7 hours or 7 days. I'll tell you what, it takes a long time to grow that much hair and to look like an animal. And his fingernails became like bird claws. And at the end of the time, this is why we think he wrote this chapter, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will. That's his sovereignty. In the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom and my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles restored to me, and I was restored to my kingdom. And excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and his ways are justice. And those who walk in pride, he's able to put down. When should you fear the Lord? When you come to realize his utter sovereignty. When you come to realize that God put you where you are, God made the unchangeable features of your life, God has worked out all the minutiae of every part of your life and mine. Known unto God were all the days of my life. They were written in his book before I lived one of them. Why should we fear the Lord? Because he already is in charge. He already knows everything. He's everywhere. He has all power, and he's utterly holy. And only he can live my life for his glory. I can't. Joseph came to fear God. It's portable. You can take it anywhere. Chuck Swindoll tells a story of how he got off the Marine landing craft in Okinawa, and as soon as the craft door hit the sand, all the men ran down to the red light alley to have their fun. He was all alone, and he had a Bible down the bottom of his duffel bag. And they all stopped the Jeep and said, hey, you coming? He said, no. You know, it's portable. It works anywhere. It works in the Marine Corps. It works at school. It works at home. It works when nobody's watching. It works when your parents are gone, when your wife is sick, when your husband's away. It works all the time. Fearing God, livingly acknowledging that you, God, see me. And when you come into that point of life, when you come to that acknowledgement that God's everywhere present, he knows everything, he has all power, he's utterly holy, and he's sovereign, then you enter into the condition of fearing God and saying, how can I do wickedness against the God who sees me?